I'm Jane Duell. I'll be moderating the session today. You're in the 2022 Lacey Stormwater Design Manual program. So we'll have about 20 minutes of presentation, about 10 minutes of discussion at the end. I want to introduce your three speakers. Only one is in your program, so we'll spend just a couple minutes introducing the two that didn't make it into it. Julianne Chechanover is with Herrera. She's the lead presenter, and she is in the program, so you can read about her there. Your two other presenters are Doug Christenson. He's with the city of Lacey. He's with their public works, and he's a water resources engineer with many years of experience. And Jenny Saltonstall is with Associated Earth Sciences, or AESI. She's a principal geologist and hydrologist and was co-lead on this program. So I will pass it on to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Jane. Yeah, let's go ahead and get started. I hope you all are nice and caffeinated this morning. So yeah, today we'll be talking about the 2022 Lacey Stormwater Design Manual that we'll refer to as the SDM. And specifically, we're going to talk about a few local enhancements in this manual. So I figured I'd just go over the agenda real briefly. First, we'll go over the City of Lacey background, so you can learn more about the City of Lacey. And then we'll discuss the Stormwater Design Manual, a little bit about like the history of the manual and how it's been developed, as well as the current layout of the 2022 manual. Next, we'll go into local enhancements. We'll first start off with the wet season construction SWP, and then we'll proceed to talk about Lacey's geology and infiltration requirements. Next, we'll go into our second local enhancement, which is the deep UIC wells. And lastly, we'll go over a couple lessons learned from developing the manual. Now I'll pass it over to Doug to talk about the history of the City of Lacey.
Okay,
I'll stay over here. Well, thank you for coming. City of Lacey is located in Thurston County, just east of Olympia at the south end of Puget Sound. The city was incorporated back in 1968. We're currently the 23rd largest city in Washington, but we're growing at the 4th fastest rate the last 3 years. That growth is both people moving in and area expansion through annexations. We have an average annual rainfall of just over 50 inches. And we established our storm and surface water utility back in 1985. So we've got 38 years worth of utility development. We've been pretty proactive and progressive during that time on water quality issues. We've had strong support from our council and citizens for the things that we do. We adopted the state's first LID ordinance back in the late 1990s. It was called Zero Effect Drainage Discharge Ordinance. And when the phase 2 permit came into effect in 2007, we had pretty well established stormwater programs already and just needed a little bit of adjusting for compliance with the permit. Our public works staff is about 10 people full-time in stormwater. And our storm system has now over 6,500 catch basins, 135 miles of pipe, and 50 locations where we have stormwater regional facilities. So a little on the history of our Stormwater Design Manual. Prior to 2010, we were functioning under a 1994 regional manual. And so it was due for updating at the time that the phase 2 permit came into effect. And so in 2007, we started developing our own version of the Stormwater Manual. And in January 2010, we adopted our first Stormwater Design Manual, or SDM. And we put several unique aspects into it right from the get-go. We reformatted Ecology's 5-volume Western Washington Manual into 10 chapters. So a chapter format was a big change. And then we renamed the minimum requirements as core requirements because really they're the core of what we do in stormwater management. So I thought that was more appropriate. One of the early local enhancements was that we required the design engineer on a private stormwater project to include in the maintenance manual for that project a long-term cost estimate for maintenance and repair and expenses. And it was kind of a lesson learned because HOAs in particular were not budgeting for things like dredging out a wet pond. So that was one of the early local enhancements we had in our first manual, and it carries through to today. In 2016, we did a fairly significant update along with most of you. That's when LID implementation was really stepped up and all that came with it. We reduced to 9 core requirements. We got rid of one regarding financial guarantees. Rearranged a little bit into 9 chapters and tried to condense it down more. And a local enhancement we added in 2016 was for sites that are discharging, surface discharging to impaired waterways or within a half mile of impaired waterways would do extra mitigation. This would be for, waterways that have, there were 3 criteria. One was for bacteria, one for temperature, and one for dissolved oxygen. So if you were discharging to a waterway that had any of those documented impairments, you're going to do a little more water quality mitigation. So our current 22 manual was adopted in June last year, a relatively minor update, but we did have 2 key local enhancements in that one that we're going to talk more about. One is the wet season SWIP amendment, and the other is our guidance for deep UICs. So Julianne and Jenny will be talking more about those 2 things. And so just quickly, this is our chapter layout, 10 chapters in our current manual. I've highlighted the chapters 5 and 7 because that's where these additional enhancements that we're going to be talking about are located. Basically, 10 chapters. The intent is to create kind of a logical progression that a person, a design engineer, would go through as they're developing a stormwater management plan. So chapters 1 and 2 are basically equivalent to Ecology's volume 1. 3 is all about submittal requirements. 4 is BMP selection process and considerations for incorporating LID on your site. Chapter 5 is basically equivalent to Ecology's volume 2. So it's the construction phase, stormwater management. 6 is hydrologic analysis. 7 is flow control, including, soil testing, infiltration analysis, LID, and also detention, trenches and galleries are all in there. And our, let's see, chapter 8 has treatment. Chapter 9 is a boiled down version of Ecology's volume 4 for source control. And then we added chapter 10 as a new chapter to put maintenance in its own volume there. So that's our chapter there.
I'll hand it over to, there we go. Thanks, Doug. So yeah, today I would like to talk a little bit about the first local enhancement, which is the wet season SWIP. I wanted to provide a little bit of context of why this wet season SWIP is important. The city of Lacey receives a lot of rain. For a little context here, Lacey's average annual precipitation is 51 inches. And during the wet season of October through April, Lacey receives 43 inches of rain, or about 85% of that total. And during the peak wet season of November through January, Lacey receives 24 inches of rain, or about 8 inches of rain per month. So basically the moral of the story is Lacey receives a lot of rain, and there's bound to be runoff during wet season construction, and hence the need for this wet season SWIP. I'd like to talk a little bit more detail of the differences between a typical construction SWIP and this wet season SWIP, and those things are outlined on the screen above. I'll start with erosion and sediment control. For erosion and sediment control, it's basically outlined on the left side of the screen here. There may be additional construction BMPs that are required during the wet season. These include dewatering provisions, as well as stabilized parking or other BMPs. In addition, stop work might also have to occur during the wettest months of the year, as well as a maintenance bond for the downstream system may be required. for inspections requirements, it's kind of expected that during the wet season that you would need additional inspections compared to the dry season. For example, inspections are required every other day during the wet season compared to once per week during the dry season. If the city inspector notices there's an issue on site, the inspection must occur within 24 hours compared to 10 days during the dry season. In addition, if the SWPPP needs to be updated, it must be updated within 3 days during the wet season compared to 7 days during the dry season. Now I'd like to take a little time to talk about construction schedule requirements. As many of you know, construction tends to go behind schedule. And so if the construction schedule ends up extending into the wet season, this wet season SWPPP is required. It must go over activities that would occur during the wet season and how to prevent sediment from leaving the construction site and impairing local water bodies. Last but not least, I would like to talk a little bit about enforcement actions. If worse comes to worse, the city of Lacey may require using enforcement actions. A couple of these include using notice of violation, administrative order, penalty, or stop work order. These may be implemented if sediment is leaving the construction site, or if there's insufficient erosion and sediment control BMPs on the construction site. The city of Lacey prefers, excuse me, the city of Lacey prefers to use an education approach before proceeding with enforcement actions, but this is a nice thing to have in their manual to make sure that they have the ability to enforce on their actions. And now I'd like to pass it over to Jenny to talk a little bit about Lacey's geology and infiltration considerations. I'll switch sides. Sounds good. Here you go.
Still on? Good. So, not a hydrologist, a hydrogeologist. And so I got to put my geology slide up. And so my role in the Stormwater Design Manual update was pretty minor, and it was really focused on deep infiltration. So the Ecology Manual has a whole new section on deep UIC assessments, and Lacey wanted to get that into their manual in a way that has the applicant producing submittals that are, can be checked off against. The Ecology Manual is wonderful. It's full of recommendations and considerations, and it's light on requirements for building permits or just plan review requirements. And so this was a way to translate some of that nice information into something that a reviewer could look at and say, yes, this has been included. So City of Lacey, glaciated, southern Puget Sound. You can see the Nisqually River Valley off on the east and the steep bluffs. And then City of Lacey has that black outline. That's the city limits, mostly on the upland. So glaciated upland, thin recessional outwash on top of the till. The till is this kind of purple gray color. Yeah, purple on the screen, that light purple. The recessional outwash is the light brown or tan, and it's situated on top of the till. And then below the till is a unit called advance outwash. And advance outwash on this map is a light blue color, and there's not a lot of it exposed at the ground surface. And so that context is important for thinking about infiltration, opportunities and constraints, and in particular, deep infiltration. So shallow infiltration facilities would be situated in that recessional outwash, that tan unit. But on an upland, recessional outwash is often thin, and it contains groundwater perched on top of that low permeability till. And so one other item about Lacey in particular is in the northeast part of the city, it's zoned for light industrial. Freeway there, good access, a lot of space. And so light industrial means large impervious areas, lots of runoff. That part of the city also has very thin outwash, if at all. And so the ground surface is a hard till. And so that means that's a lot of water to store, or there's a lot of incentive to look for infiltration opportunities. So the city has gotten some submittals for deep infiltration, or infiltration that is digging through the till layer to get into the underlying outwash. So that's some context The city had received submittals prior to this update, and so this update in particular was focused on addressing some issues that they had experienced with those earlier submittals. And so these are some of the items that are specific to deep infiltration in the City of Lacey manual. And so the first topic is depth. And so the ecology manual describes what deep infiltration is, but City of Lacey has applied some numbers to those recommendations. So in Lacey, if the till is thicker than 5 feet or extends to a depth of at least 10 feet, infiltration through that layer will be categorized as deep infiltration and will need to meet the demonstrative requirements for UIC registration within the city. And so that's a big deal for applicants. And so the other part, excuse me, of the manual includes some early design submittals. This gives the city the opportunity to interact with the applicant early in the process to make sure they understand what these requirements mean in terms of their project timing. And so there's 3 key submittals. The first is that historical contamination study. It's like a phase 1 environmental site assessment. The idea is that the applicant reviews the past site land use specific to looking for sources of contamination. The second one is a hydrogeologic characterization plan. So in the manual, there are some very specific monitoring well installation requirements and some requirements for baseline data collection that are above and beyond what most applicants would be picturing. And so it's really important that the applicant review the manual. And so this requirement of a plan forces that onto the applicant early in the process so that they recognize that these requirements exist. And then the third one is an infiltration testing plan. So deep UICs are, you often see non-standard infiltration testing methods. And so that the city wants the applicant to think through how they would go about testing the permeability and providing design rate information early in the process again, so that the city has a chance to review the plan and provide comments in advance. The third item is the hydrogeologic study. That's outlined pretty well in the ecology manual. But what the city's experienced is that the hydrogeologic studies submitted are kind of a repurposing of regional information, and there's little connection between the site-specific exploration data conducted for geotech and that regional information. It was as if, you know, 2 different people put those sections together. And so the intent here is that the hydrogeologic study has the applicant relating their site-specific data to regional. It seems like they should do that automatically, but here there are some specific requirements laid out in the manual. Drinking water purveyor notification. This is something that's in there, but the city put in specific requirements on how and when that notification should occur. And the contingency plan. This is a new one, and it's really important to recognize that in the event of an infiltration facility failure, it can be challenging to remediate a non-standard system. Thank you. Speed it up. So the contingency plan identifies the responsible party. So who is responsible for monitoring the system and maintenance and repairs? And that plan for maintenance and repairs should include contingency that could be property reserves, a backup well, or easements. Treatment is just that there has to be treatment of all water going into the UIC system, either basic or enhanced. Many times treatment stops at the water quality treatment storm, and flows that exceed that can go untreated. For a deep UIC, all water must pass through some form of treatment. And then the last section is general well design, infiltration testing, and construction considerations. So here, these are not requirements, they are considerations for the applicant. So I'll hand it back to Doug.
So I'll run through some lessons learned, just real quickly. We've been using our own manual now, the SDM, since 2010. So we've got a good dozen years of use with the chapter format, which we've stuck with. We feel that it makes specific information easier to find, and that it's a nice logical progression for, as close as you can anyway, for a design engineer to follow while developing their plans. Making the manual as concise, clear, and user-friendly as possible makes for fewer questions and better submittals. So we've tried to condense the manual down to what you essentially need, and a lot of the extraneous stuff we've left out. Bullet points are clearer than the wall of text. We've had requirements that in the past were kind of buried within paragraphs and people would miss them. So we pulled them out and put them in bullet point formation more and more, and especially in our newer manual. And a drainage report template is one of the enhancements we have in the current manual. We had a checklist to make sure your submittal is complete, but people don't like to use checklists. We're getting negative feedback on that, both internally and externally. So we've gone to a drainage report template where it's kind of like just fill in the boxes, and it makes for more consistent submittals and more complete submittals. Lessons learned for the wet season SWIP, it's the result of lessons learned in the past. We've just implemented it with this new manual. So this is the first winter, so I can't really tell you how well it's working yet, because we're still, we're just getting going on implementing it. But the lesson we learned in the past is that a construction SWIP prepared for summer work might not be adequate when you get that deluge in the winter time. And we were having issues, especially with sites that don't infiltrate well. They have nowhere to go with their water. And any site can make a mess, but our big problems were these sites that have till, they have perch groundwater. Sometimes the site will completely flood. That center picture is a site that was just great all summer long, but when the rains came, they turn it into a big kiddie pool with the silk fencing. So that's not working. And then for the DPICs, again, it's because we've had several projects that proposed them before we had any standards in place. And so we learned some lessons there. The big one is if a project site doesn't have adequate subsurface characterization before they get approval, then you might end up with unexpected issues later, such as legacy contamination. The overall lesson learned is that cities and counties, we turn ecology's guidance into enforceable standards. So I suggest to anybody to use local enhancements to go beyond the minimums and tailor your requirements to address local issues. So thank you. With that, we'll take questions.